Right, morning everyone. Happy Tuesday. So I thought what I'll discuss today is visions, grand visions, because Labour have one, they've published them. You may not be aware of what they are, that's no reflection on you. They've not exactly got it out into the public domain. Apparently there are moves by Labour to do just that, but I thought I'd start off to begin with and by examining this notion. You may, if you read opinion pieces in The Guardian, where's Labour's grand vision? They need a grand vision in order to win the election. To which I think, well, do they? So should we have a look at the history of grand visions? So my first election that I was old enough to vote for was 1997. So you think, okay, so Labour won a landslide. They took over from the Tories. They must have had a grand vision. So what was their grand vision? Well, they didn't have one, really, did they? They said they were going to cut class sizes a bit, and they did. They said they were going to cut NHS waiting lists a bit, and they did. They said they were going to cut VAT on heating bills, and they did. So they had a series they had 5 main policies, and of course they had a manifesto, but there was no grand vision, and yet they still won the election. So then you go, okay, so where's this grand vision idea come from? Well, David Cameron thought he had a grand vision. In 2010, he presented his grand vision. I don't know whether people remember, his grand vision was the big society. Big society. Now, what the big society was a cunning plan to basically remove public services, to say, no, we don't want to pay for that or that or that. No, we don't want that. But we understand that the people want those services. So what we'll do is we'll cut them all, and then people will volunteer their own time to deliver those services. So what did we end up out of that? We ended up with massive numbers of food banks. That was the big society, huge numbers of food banks. So basically, the big society was this grand vision to make us all poorer. Then the next grand vision was Brexit. Now, if the big society was about making us poorer, Brexit was about taking away our rights. And if you're wondering why all the Brexiteers are still complaining about Brexit right now, it's because it wasn't about leaving the EU, it's about taking away our rights, and we still have some rights left. So that's why they're chuntering. So you could argue at this point, do people even really want a grand vision? Because the grand vision hurts. They've had 2 grand visions in the last decade or so, and it's hurt quite a lot. So I would say the history of my experience of election winning campaigns is that most of the time there is no grand vision. There are policies which will make things better. When there are grand visions, they're very painful. That being said, Labour do have a grand vision for better or worse. And Jonathan Reynolds, who is the shadow business secretary, so he's fairly senior within the Labour leadership, and he has appeared on this channel. So if you go in later on, not now, if you go later on to the videos, the homepage, you should see the video with Jonathan Reynolds. He's saying that Labour is going to be the most interventionist party in a generation. So there will be people who are going, well, Labour are probably just going to be a little bit less Tory than the Tories. They're just going to tinker around the edges, tinker with the current system. And this is not their plan at all. Now, I will say, of course, there's a difference between having a plan and being able to implement it. But if anyone says that Labour are just planning to do things a little bit better, but with the same system, either they haven't actually bothered to read Labour's policy papers, or they're lying. So I'm going to go through some. Now, it is Jonathan Reynolds recently featured in a Guardian article where he was saying, we're aware that people are not aware of this vision. They don't know what our plans are. That's totally true. Arguably, it's a difficult one to get across, because this is not a vision to make us poor or anything. So it's a tricky one. But I'm going to point out, I've got images either side of my head of some policy papers that are very interesting. Now, the one with the image of the UK on it is the paper that was commissioned by Labour, by Starmer, and prepared by Gordon Brown. Now, this one does not contain formal Labour policies. It's a proposal It's absolutely huge. I'll make sure after the video, once we've done the post-production stuff, that there are links to both of these papers in there if you want to read them. The Gordon Brown one is absolutely massive. I'm going to pick out some of the things that Keir Starmer personally seems keen on. So just because Gordon Brown's written this paper doesn't mean all of it will become formal Labour policy, but the ones that Keir Starmer has talked up, and therefore we can, until we find out different, we can say are formal Labour policy. So there's the reform of the House of Lords. And this will meet some opposition, of course. The idea is to get rid of all the unelected lords, including Nadine Dorries, because she's heading that way. Out you go and scrounge somewhere else, and everyone will be elected. But it won't just be replacing the unelected lords with elected members, whatever we end up calling them, because I don't think they'll be lords. The idea is that the House of Lords, as well as doing the job that the House of Lords does now, will also be, it'll represent the regions of the UK. And I don't just mean England, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. I mean properly splitting up the country into many more bits than that. And they're also going to have a role in being able to take the government to court over constitutional matters. So at the moment, the government, the Conservative government, have been trying to browbeat the courts. So our courts are still technically independent, but because the Conservatives have threatened to remove that independence, there's a feeling that there are some cases that are not being brought, or where courts are giving the government a light touch because they fear the Conservatives will remove their independence. So this would be a system of effectively taking away the government's power to self-regulate. It would be a case of allowing the House of Lords to say, we think you might have breached the law in this way, so we are going to order the Supreme Courts to investigate. Other things that are in Gordon Brown, there's a lot of things in there, but the things that I've heard Keir Starmer personally get on board with, and therefore we can take to be Labour policies. As well as this devolution, and I don't mean, as I say, I don't mean just giving the Scottish and Welsh governments more power. I mean, having decisions made around the country. Okay, so the problem we have at the moment is our decision making is very London centric for two reasons. First of all the decision makers are in London, and Keir Starmer has said this is no good. Secondly, London itself just sucks in investment from everywhere. So it is theoretically the case that if you want to invest in a lot of different sectors, in or around London is generally the way to do it, because you've already got your hubs established, which is fine from a pure investment return point of view, but is absolutely crushing for the Midlands, particularly the North Midlands, the north of England, Scotland, Wales, particularly North Wales. And it's Northern Ireland's probably not going to be so bad because it's the only thing that's actually gained out of Brexit in terms of attracting investment. So the idea is that a lot of this decision making takes place outside. Getting rid of foreign money in politics is a big one. Getting rid of foreign money in politics. Anything you do to change the funding of politics will have very far-reaching impacts. Again, this is not tinkering around the edges, is it? This is not tinkering around the edges. If you change the funding model for politics, you will change politics. If you change the electoral system for politics, you will change politics. So I, for example, am a big fan of proportional representation. That's not in their policy papers, by the way. But, if you change the way politics works, you will change our politics. Aaron saying, I'll just got a couple of comments here. It says, I know it's terrible to have to reduce them to 3 words, but only these stay in voters' minds. Well, this is exactly why I think, and I haven't finished going through some of these features yet, this is why I think when Jonathan Reynolds says we need to do better in terms of sharing this vision we have with the public, it's like, yeah, okay. It's not an easy thing, to be fair, because what we're talking, usually when you have a grand political vision, you have to break it down to a quick 3-word slogan, don't you, ultimately? And the problem with that is what we're talking about here is a genuine revolution in the way politics is being done. which is not easy to communicate to people who just want the 3-word slogan. And that's why ultimately Labour, probably like, Labour in 97, may well have to focus on just some key marquee policies. But if they want to try and explain to people the benefits of this vision, so be it. They are going to struggle because the mainstream media is not going to be keen on it. It challenges them directly. Another one that's in the Gordon Brown paper is banning most second jobs for MPs. Again, that will change politics because it makes it more difficult for MPs or for people to become motivated to become MPs for those lucrative second jobs. I mean, the ones that are really destructive are the lobbying jobs. I mean, we've seen the exposés, haven't we? We saw led by donkeys, trapping a few Tory MPs. We saw, it was the Times, wasn't it? The Times that trapped Scott Benton, the Blackpool MP, or well, he's going to be very soon the former Blackpool MP. In fact, hold on. So, but anyway, that's the Gordon Brown paper. And it contains a lot in there, but do not confuse it for formal Labour policy. It was commissioned by Labour, it was commissioned by Starmer to solve a particular problem. He's got on board with certain things in it, but not everything. So what it is are policy proposals. But then the second paper is an actual Labour policy paper. Which way am I going? Hang on. There we go. Something. The other one, anyway, a mission-driven government to end sticking plaster politics. So I'll pick again. Now, this is a much shorter one, by the way. The Gordon Brown one's huge. It's well over 100 pages. This one's just a few pages. Now, the things that are in the Labour policy. So let me give you an example of a problem it aims to solve. Because if you read the Labour policy document, you may think that, because it doesn't give specific examples of how it could apply. So you've got to actually work through it. So I'll give you an example of something, a problem that it aims to solve. So government is split up into departments. So we're aware of that. And the government can change what those departments are depending on what they think are the key issues of the day. So you have the fairly standard ones. Of course, you have the Treasury, you have the Home Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Department for Education, the Department for Health and Social Care, which, you may say, probably should be split up. Should we have a Department for Health and a Department for Social Care? You've got a Department for Industrial Strategy, Business, Energy, blah, 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 blah. So you have all these government departments, and at the top of each government department is a Secretary of State. They sit in Cabinet. They are the ones who drive the policies of that department. You also have junior ministers in there, so they drive individual bits. So, for example, in the Home Office, we have an immigration minister, so they will have a focus on immigration. You have a policing minister, they've got their focus on policing and so on. But the Secretary of State sits on top of it and they drive all the policies. Now, imagine you need to do something. There's an urgent need to address a problem in the country. Net zero could be an obvious one, but there's any number of problems we may have in the country that the government need to deal with. So what you do when the government wants to solve a problem, and I know it's a while since we've had a government that's wanted to solve problems, but when you have a government that wants to solve problems, what they do is they decide on a general policy and then they work out which government department should take ownership of it. Because someone needs to be responsible for driving this policy. A Secretary of State needs to be responsible. So you try and work out which government department needs to deal with this. So let's imagine you've got a problem where actually it's going to need multiple government departments to deal with it. So net zero, for example, now you think net zero or the Department for Energy is the most, although at the moment there isn't a Department for Energy, it's lumped in with a few other policy areas. But you would think the department that deals with energy would be the one to go for. And you think, okay, yeah, but there's also an issue with transport. If you're going to have a net zero policy, that's going to have to include transport. So the Department of Transport is going to need to be involved. Then you'd also think, and if you look through the list of government departments, you'll find there's other departments that are also going to need to have a role in this. And then you think to yourself, so we can give it to this department and that Secretary of State drive it, but they're going to need other departments to get involved as well. But that Secretary of State can't tell another government department what to do or how to spend its budget. So what you need is something that sits on top of all these government departments that can drive this policy. And that is part of what this policy paper is about. It's about acknowledging that the current way policies are pursued and decisions are made doesn't work. Because what has to keep, otherwise you have to keep creating government departments for individual policies. So we'll go through another few comments before I sort of come back to other things that are in this policy paper, although that is, for me, the biggest thing. Should not ban jobs, just say they can't get paid for doing them. The problem with that, Richard, is when it comes to the lobbying jobs, see, there's two fiddles as an MP. There's two ways in which you can basically debase your office. The first is just paid lobbying. So a company hires you, they pay you. In theory, they're paying you to advise them. But what they're actually paying you for is to put them in contact with government ministers for public contracts. You know, in theory, you might be advising them about the way to go to bid for a public contract, but really you're their man or woman on the inside. Now, you could say, well, if they don't get paid for it, they won't take up that sort of work. Well, no, but then there is another way as well. So what is quite common, it's more common for senior ministers, but it can happen for MPs in general. So here's what happens is you help a company to either drive certain policies or attract funding, whatever. And then when you leave politics years later, they give you a seat on the board. So it's not unusual when you watch it as well after this election. So there's going to be quite a lot of MPs step down. Watch some of the Tory MPs because they've just been in power. Several of those MPs will miraculously get jobs on the board, on executive boards, or well, non-executive positions really, I suppose. But they'll get positions on various committees or boards or as advisors for large multinational corporations. That's their reward for what they've been doing in Parliament. So just saying they can't get paid doesn't stop them doing the lobbying work, because they will take their payday when they leave politics instead. So you really do need to stop them doing this work. There are certain things like, you know, MPs writing books on their own. You know, if they write their own book, okay, you can say they can write books or write articles in newspapers. Okay, maybe. Or you could, obviously, there are certain professions, doctors, lawyers, for example, that may need to do some work to maintain registrations. But by and large, what really needs attacking is the lobbying, whether it's paid for while they're MPs or paid for later. It's ultimately the consultation work that needs to be knocked on the head. A comment there from Master Template says that Labour, as a response to someone else, but Labour can fix the problems, but if and when the Tories get back in, it'll be undone and the legacy ruined, so they should implement. So this will be to proportional representation, second or third term. Yes, so this is an issue. So the way Labour are looking at completely restructuring the way decisions are made, and they are. If you read this policy paper, it's impossible to read it, even if you're not sure about exactly what all the direct implications will be. It's impossible to read this, and it is only a few pages long, the one that's got a mission driven. It's impossible to read it and think to yourself, yeah, they're just planning on doing more of the same, or even doing more of the same more competently, or with a little bit more socialism. No, it's like, it's a fundamental attack on capitalism, this policy document, because what they're talking about is, see, I've often in the past said that the problem with our economic model is that a business justifies itself in terms of the profits it makes. A business should justify itself in terms of its value to society. So, for example, windfall taxes shouldn't even need to be a particular policy debate. It should be a given. You know, oil companies are making extra profits, massive extra profits. And this is beyond the profits they're making as part of their business model. When we talk about windfall profits, we don't just mean the profits they've made over the last couple of years. We mean specifically the profits they've made on top of the profits they were going to make. The ones that were, so these are profits that have nothing to do with their business plan. You could justify taking 100% of those profits in a windfall tax, but you don't have to do that. You could just take like 70% or something. That still leaves them extra. Because remember, windfall profit is profit for work they didn't do. They haven't done anything for it. It's not like having a particularly good year, but it's still linked to your business model. It is nothing to do with their business model. It's because a crackhead in Moscow invaded Eastern Europe. That's why they've made all this extra money. So the government could say, well, actually, you need to justify your worth to society. You can keep some of it, but we're going to take most of it because it's not money you've earned, but we can put it to better use. But we don't have this mod. We everything's, you know, it's like we excuse business decisions because, well, they have to make profit, and that's right, but we could change the system. And this talks about it. You know, it talks about moving the measure. It's talking about changing the way we measure success and failure of a project. It's talking about how businesses have to justify their existence in this policy document. You know, what they're fundamentally talking about in this short few pages is challenging a capitalist model. Now, it's really ambitious. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that, you know, Labour win a decent majority 5 years down the line, we don't have a capitalist economic model anymore. And we're not suggesting that 10 years down the line that the world looks as, oh, that's really good, and we have this socialist utopia for the rest of time. But this document up here is the absolute opposite of just getting into power and just trying to do things more competently. You know, in fact, some of it to me seems too ambitious because it's talking about fundamentally breaking up the way decisions are made in Westminster and in Parliament. And there's definitely going to be potential pitfalls to it, because for a start, you start putting decision making into the hands of people in different regions. And you think to yourself, so where's the accountability? Because that's the big issues people have. It's like, okay, we can see the problems with centralized decision making in London. But if you start putting those decisions in the hands of people regionally, who ultimately gets the blame when things go wrong? The national government. So where's the accountability? Like we see it with local councils, don't we? Local councils. I mean, there was a Tory council in London. What was it called? They built this big heap of dirt. The Marble was it the Marble Arch Mound or something? I can't remember. I don't know London. But there was a Tory council in London that spent millions of pounds on basically getting a big heap of earth, right? They made a hill and they thought it would be a tourist attraction. So they thought they could charge people to walk to the top of this dirt pile in London. Now, it turns out, it was the Marble Arch Mound. Thank you, Richard. And it turns out that people didn't want to pay money to walk up to the top of a hill in London and go, oh, London, and then walk back down again. So then they had to pay, I think it was 600,000 pounds to have it removed. Millions of pounds wasted. And that's a local council, right? The only accountability they may get is in the local area. They probably don't even get that. That is the sort of decision making that can be made. And some people will look at that and go, well, this may happen if Keir Starmer removes decision making to more regions. And there is a genuine issue there. So this is what I mean about it being very ambitious. It sounds, and it is the way forward. You cannot have decisions made in London for everything because they will favour businesses in or around London. Because London, just by its nature, just because it's so huge and has such good infrastructure, naturally sucks investment in anyway. So if you also put the decision makers there, Of course, they're going to be very London-centric themselves because they're being advised by people who live and work in London. So you need to get the decisions moved out. I mean, we've seen the benefits of devolution in Wales and Scotland, for example. So we need that more widespread. But there are pitfalls. It is very ambitious, and it will be very, very interesting. But anyway, let's go through some comments as well as we finish off. A suggestion from Aaron: everyone working in politics has to disclose private financials for up to 10 years after leaving office. But even then, once they've left office, what do you do? Like, they've left office. They can declare it as much as they like. And if someone goes, oh, I think they were a bit dodgy in their time in office because they've now got, they seem to pursue policies that benefited Mr. Miggins's, chicken factory. And now Mr. Miggins's chicken factory has given them a seat on the board. That sounds a bit dodgy. Well, they've left politics, don't matter. They're raking it in. So the only way to stop it is to stop them doing the work. That is the only way to stop it. And to be honest, an MP's work should be very full. MPs should have no excuse for saying, well, they get a bit bored, they need a bit of extra work. We can understand some of them will do a bit of extra work for certain things, okay. Some of them have to, like doctors and lawyers. But lobbying, no, there's plenty they can do for their community and in Parliament. Can work for public, not private company. Well, the way they do that is becoming ministers. Banking industry needs an overhaul and stricter rules. Absolutely disgusting how they get away with making a fortune out of misery. The banking is a really difficult issue to deal with, though, because you really would need a major reform of the economy to change it, because the way bankers get away with it, and they know this as well, there's two ways in which bankers are always going to become rich, even when things go belly up. The first is that, and we saw this with the Kwasi-Kwarteng budget, the Liz Truss Kwasi-Kwarteng budget. Ultimately, what happened when they crashed the economy, you lost a load of value on your pension funds. That's the first to be hit. And that is why the government will always have to bail out the banking industry, because otherwise pensions disappear. And, we can't have that. And the industry knows that. And the other thing is, even when it's not like that cynical, when you have to shore up the banking industry to protect people's savings, say, even if it's nothing to do with pensions, just to protect their savings, well, that also that is also to the benefit of people who deal in equities. So unless you had a fundamental, and I mean a complete reboot of the economy, and I don't think any individual government could do it, it would have to be international. Banking you can regulate it, and obviously the Tories have decided, I mean, we did regulate it after the banking crisis, and then the Tories have started unpicking that. So they're actually inviting, if we have now another banking crisis, and there is an economist who was in America who was dealing with the last banking crisis who said there could be one on the horizon because of the iffy relations between the US and China. He said that could go badly. All it would take is a misunderstanding on one side or the other. And let's face facts, if Trump gets back into power, that could easily happen. And we could end up with another banking crisis. Well, if the Tories are currently now weakening us, if we had a banking crisis right now, the Conservatives with their measures over the last year have basically stripped away some of the defences we put in place after the last banking crisis. So we've made ourselves more vulnerable to one. So that needs putting back in place before there's another one, because there will always be another one. There'll always be a banking crisis on the horizon. But anyway, right, last few, because we're sort of running out of time. I keep waffling on. Someone who is an EU national, why is the idea of including voters that are not British nationals, such as living here for 5+ years, couldn't this be very beneficial for Labour voting base? Yes, absolutely. So it's not a policy we're going to see put into place with the Conservatives in power. I would just say, I think we may be up for a very interesting time in the next 10 years. after the election. Obviously, we still need Labour to win, and with a decent majority. That is not in the bag yet. The reform of the House of Lords, Keir Starmer is really putting his weight behind it. That is going to be the job of the first Parliament. It'll be very interesting and it'll meet a lot of resistance. We will see. But if that is completed in the first Parliament, I would just say we may indeed see some further reforms in the second, which might even be changing the voting system, or, as you say there, increasing the number of people who get to vote, including lowering the voting age to 16, but in general, we may well see reforms of the way we vote in general elections in the second term. But there's not been any specific hints of it. But what I would say is there is a real desire within the Labour Party to do that, as in the membership. So there's definitely driving forces within Labour to push for greater reforms. So I would not be at all surprised to see them coming. I just would say don't necessarily expect to see them in the next election. Last question here will go from Daisy. How could we get rid of people like Nigel Farage? Easy, proportional representation. Do you know what happens with proportional representation? Nigel Farage wins a seat in Parliament. Easiest way to get rid of a clown like that is to actually put him in Parliament. Because with the EU Parliament, he just didn't turn up, but he got away with it because he was, it was a bit like, well, we want to. It was almost like being a bit like Sinn Féin not taking their seats in Westminster. It's like, well, we don't want to be part of that system, so he could justify it to his followers. Put him into a Parliament that he claims to support, and then people can see just how useless and lazy he is. That is the best way. That putting someone in Parliament is the best way to make them completely impotent. But anyway, we'll call it there. Thanks very much for coming on. I shall be back on again on Thursday. Graham will be back on tomorrow. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more of these. And there'll be some details in the description below, probably in about 15 minutes, for links to these, as well as details for how you can join Patreon if you'd be interested in supporting the channel further as well. Put comments below. If there's a particular topic that you want discussing, put them in the comments below. And until next time, I will see you later.